Okay, going live with Emily and Meg. I'm going to go ahead and add them. There we go. Hello. Hey, Meg.
Hey, Kelsey.
Oh, there's Emily. Hopefully she can get into it. We'll see how this goes. That seems to always be the peril of
Right.
live joining.
Well, and if we
I was just
need to back out and come back in, then we can do that.
okay, I was able to accept her, so let's see. Hi, Jess.
Hi, Jess.
Okay.
Emily, where are you?
This seems to be like the perennial, yeah, it says very romance is unable to join. I will try one more time, and if it doesn't work, then we will exit out and restart.
All right.
Hi,
Sounds good.
Stephanie. Hi, Amy.
There
There we
you
go.
are.
We're there. We did it.
We're there. Okay.
Okay. So it seems like we've got like a nice group of people here already. So shall we just
Yeah.
begin?
Let's go
do
for
this
it.
thing. Okay, so hey friends, welcome tonight. We are so pleased to welcome Meg of MegGatzaBookclub. Hello, Meg. She's our guest lecturer. This is our first in our lecture series for Romancelandia University, and Meg's books that covers a lot. Meg's books that covers a lot of ground as far as what she reads. But she is a super voracious reader of historical romance, which is why we asked her here tonight to help us parse through all of the very common eras that we see in British historical romances. So we're going to like sort of dip our toes outside of Britain, but we're going to stick to like the Georgian, the Regency, the Victorian, the Edwardian, and walk you through. By the end of this lecture, which we hope will be around 30 minutes, we want you to feel really comfortable when you're reading a book to sort of place yourself in time. Even if you like missed, like sometimes it's like the prologue is like 1837 and then you just move on. And then several chapters later, you're like flipping back like, wait a freaking minute, when is this happening? So Meg is going to be our guide for teaching us how to place ourselves within these stories. And if any of you are Romancelandia Uni students and you're here for some extra credit, just want to let you know that you can receive extra credit for being here tonight with us live and for watching the replay later, and we will give you more information on that later. So without further ado, Meg, welcome. We're so pleased to have you.
Yay.
Yay, I'm so glad to be here.
I know. So Meg and I have buddy read a lot of historical romance, but also a lot of fantasy, speculative fiction, just a little bit of everything. And very infamously, we were reading a retelling of the Napoleonic Wars with dragons. And I made a comment that was very revealing of the fact that I really don't know anything about the Napoleonic Wars. And Meg just said, like, Kelsey, where do you think all the second sons have been fighting in historical romance? And I was like, never thought about it. So this is Meg giving us the 101 on historical periods. And Meg, I would love to learn a little bit more about just your romance journey, how long you've been reading historical romance, and also your special interests. Like, you've studied history, and would love to hear a little bit more about the periods that you've studied.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Meg of MegGatzaBookclub, and that's like one of the funniest comments about where do you think the second sons were fighting, because that's like very much something I've always thought about, is how to place myself in a sort of historical period while I'm reading a book. I have been reading historical romance probably, I actually think my first was a Judith Ivory like maybe 10 or something years ago, but I didn't really read a lot of historical romance for a while. I read mostly science fiction, speculative fiction, fantasy, and some historical fiction for just the longest time. But Courtney Milan, which I'm actually buddy reading with Kelsey right now, was my first real historical romance series, the Brothers Sinister, and I'm having a blast revisiting that, 7 or 8 years later now. So Kelsey, asked me in prep here to say how many historical romance books I've read. It's probably only about 500. It's a lot, but I do read a lot. And that's over the course of many years. It may not be that many, but anyway, I read about 250 historical romances last year, just to sort of give you a little bit of context. In terms of history, I did study medieval history a little bit in college. I took several seminars in it. I did not major in it. I majored in religious studies and also physics, which is not really related to reading, but I learned a lot about sort of historical trends and how to place yourself in a historical trend, and looking for different kinds of source materials. But really the biggest thing I took away from my history classes was that when you're studying history, you're also studying the time period that the history study is happening in. So if you, and I've been talking with people a lot about this today, especially with Tori's post on George at Higher, just thinking about, if I'm reading a book that was, or if I'm reading about, let's say, I studied the early Middle Ages, like primarily, if I was reading something that was written in, 600 of the Common Era, I would be seeing it through the lens of somebody in the 600 CE time. If I'm reading about that from even like 600 years later, I'm reading it from the lens of somebody who's trying to put their own spin on it 600 years later. So we're getting the same thing when we're thinking about historical romances. Everything is also indicative of the era that it happens in, or that it's being written in, not just the era that is like being talked about. So there's no such thing in my mind as like authentic history. Like you can look at dates and you can say, yes, this thing happened on this date at this time. That's my least favorite kind of history though, because honestly, like, I'm terrible at remembering dates. I'm terrible at remembering names. But like really what you're looking for is like the trends that happen sort of socially, what happens with, let's say, like I'll be talking about this a little bit in terms of like, who's fighting for what, not just like, the French and the English were fighting, because that was basically this whole period that we're going to be talking about, but really like who is doing the fighting, why are they doing the fighting, what's being banned, like are they smuggling, are they not smuggling, are they sending big ships, are they sending small ships, are they sending people on foot, like all these things are really interesting to me, but also the trends that drive some of those wars, like what's being caused by what kind of unrest, sort of sociopolitically in the UK. And then just sort of broader framework, again, Emily talked about this a little bit. This is focused primarily on English history. I am not an English history specialist by any means. This is sort of a lot of research that I have done as I have become more of a historical romance fan. It is, I've picked this era to talk about tonight, or this sort of region to talk about tonight, because it's what most of our historical romances are in. I don't actually read a lot of historical romances that are set in the U.S., so there's not any of that really here. We'll touch on it a little bit, but I think that we want to maybe, if this is successful, do a part two, and maybe find somebody who has read like a lot of Beverly Jenkins to like sort of follow the trends of different parts of American history as well, because you can't just think about history as like one region doing one thing. That's kind of what colonialism ended up being, right? Like that's like UK being like, oh, we own everything, so it's our history, we get to choose what's going on, and that's not the goal here. The goal here is to just give us this trend of the things that we read, that we see a lot of in our historical romances.
I love that. So thinking about the Regency period first, which is kind of where we're starting on the timeline, and also because it absolutely.
We're actually starting a little earlier.
We're starting 100 years earlier, Kelsey.
The Regency is the madness of King George, yeah. But we want to go back. We want to visit.
I'm still stuck in because we've had a lot of conversation today about Tori's Regency post and just how much conversation this has started even just among us. So my brain is still very much in the Regency and how that kicked off historical romance as a genre.
Well, aren't we all
but yes.
Here tonight because so many people just refer to historical romance broadly
as
Regency romance, and this is what we're kind of dispelling. Like it's fine to use shorthand, it's fine to just use the cultural language that we're all agreeing on, but if we want to like get down into the nitty gritty, that's what we're here to do.
Yep. Okay, so Meg, why don't you start us at the beginning of our timeline and we'll dive in there and then talk a little bit about books that place us in that timeline and some of our historical markers.
Yeah. So the first era that we're going to talk about is the Georgian Era. It is actually the era that does encompass the Regency time period. But the Georgian Era is the reigns of King George the First, Second, Third, Fourth, and then usually William the Fourth. I think it's William the Fourth. It spans from 1714 to 1837. And so it's a long, long period. And I'm going to sort of focus into a couple of parts. We're going to have the sort of early Georgian period, which is 1714, basically through the Regency, which starts in 1810. The trend, so the Georgian era starts when the sort of the Stuart rule with Elizabeth ends. All of that ended previously, and there's like some weird, my history between like Elizabeth and George the First is murky. There's a lot of kings and queens who come and go, but one of them is King James of Scotland, who is the one who the risings in Scotland happened over. So 1714 is the Georgians take over the Hanover kings. They are sort of outsiders. They spoke German. They had different ideas of how to rule. So there's a little bit of issues with, especially the Scottish people, wanting to retain some of their own rights and their sort of own autonomy. They're like, these foreigners are coming in, we don't like this. So that takes us to 1715 with the first Jacobite Rising. That's the one, not as many people know about it because it's not the one that's an Outlander. It's the one where King James loses and gets exiled the first time. He gets exiled to Italy. And there's a lot of it's like a really difficult time period for the sort of Scottish people there, this is sort of the tail end of the Great Age of piracy. For people who, like Kelsey and I, have chosen to do pirates for one of our syllabus sections, so that's you can kind of see some trends with that as well. The second Jacobite Rising is 1745. That's the one that happens in Outlander, so that's the one that more people are familiar with. And that's when Bonnie Prince Charlie was like, hey guys, I want my dad back on the throne, and I have enough charisma to make it happen. And he kind of thought he did, and they were pretty successful for a little while, but also not really. And then sort of going along the lines of wars, I don't love talking about history in terms of war, but there's a lot of them, and they're kind of like major highlights for what was shaping some of the larger political landscape. The 7 Years' War, which is also sometimes called the French and Indian War, the British colonies versus the French colonies, that in North America, that's another place the Second Sons used to go to fight. So that was 1754 to 1763. Obviously, American Revolution, 1776. French Revolution, 1789. And then sort of heading on into the Regency Era, and again, we'll get to some of those things later. The sort of King George III, who's the Mad King George, he was the one he started having mental declines in the 1780s. So even though the official Regency era doesn't actually start until George IV became the Prince Regent, there were a lot of movements to try to remove King George III from power. Some of them might have been because they were mad at him for losing that revolution, but a lot of it was also just that he was mentally slipping. Yeah.
Thinking about some of our books, so as you were walking through those periods, see if I can guess, right? Mm-hmm. At your pleasure, Meredith Duran, first Jacobite uprising.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay. Right. Lesser well known. So any of our Meredith Duran fans or anybody reading Meredith Duran with us in March, that is one of her true standalones and the only one that I've read in that period, I think. I don't think I've read another historical romance in the first Jacobite uprising.
I have not either. That's the only one that I have read. But that's a really good one. It's not one that has easy tropes for a lot of people. There's like a kidnapping, and there's a lot of kidnappings that happen in Georgian era romances, to be honest. But there's some kidnapping, forced marriage sort of stuff. But it because it's Meredith Duran, it's high angst, but it also doesn't read like a Joanna Lindsay, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And really gets into the politics of what was happening at the time and allegiances. Yeah, with both main characters, definitely plays into that romance.
Yeah.
You've also got Maiden Lane in this, and that's huge. For this group of readers, like I haven't read it yet. I know I need to, but we've got a lot of Maiden Lane readers.
Yeah, so Maiden Lane is, for those who don't know, a 12-book series by Elizabeth Hoyt, plus I think 3 novellas. I don't remember. I read them last year, and they're very gritty. They go into a lot of detail of sort of what the slums were like, especially in this area where there's an orphanage, and there's gin laws in terms of who's allowed to have gin, who's allowed to make gin. There's illegal gin stills, and sort of the temperance movements of like who can and can't have access to this. Thank you, Emily. Who can and can't have access to some of the alcohol. So that was like sort of the moral degradation of the common people, as the aristocrats would be like, oh, you are drinking gin, you are lower class. So that's something to be really pay attention to. But that's also when I read it with Kiss and Let Me Tell a Chat last year, we were joking about not like pretending they're not just taking off their wigs and hanging out like all dirty and spying on each other bathing, because the bathing probably didn't happen the same way. But it's really fun to think about like some of these like dirty, gritty historical romances from that era, because they were not bathing the way we would like them to bathe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then I know we have more books in this era, but we got more eras to get to.
I know.
So we got to get to the Regency. We got to give the people what they want.
Well, I'm gonna hit just one more in my Georgian era, because I think it's really interesting. Eloisa James has the Desperate Duchesses series, and the first one in that series. Actually, I haven't read the first one. I've read the second one and like the seventh one because of Claire. So that starts in 1783, and it's just really interesting to look at like women's fashions, and like that particular book has literally the whole plot revolves around a woman and her fashions, and how painful her updo is. And I just thought that was really interesting because it's not something that you necessarily think about now in terms of like what someone might go through to like, well, I guess everyone does think about like what you go to like look nice or to do something, but like when it's literally like stacking your hair super tall with like all sorts of things, what kind of other implications that could have.
And this time they're wearing the really wide skirts too.
Yep, wide pannier skirts, and they're making it's like the goal is to make your hips look big.
Oh, London Highwayman by Cat Sebastian, also Georgian.
That's a great duo.
Yes. That is also on the list. That'll be on so we'll be publishing a list of these books that we've recommended for later.
Jillian Only One Bookshelf requested a timeline, a graph to visualize all of this, and we will be providing this. So just stay tuned.
Okay.
All right. So we're going to move into the Regency era.
Regency.
So in sort of popular fiction, the Regency era is thought of as being like 1800 to 1837. The actual Regency itself is 1811 to 1820.
Why do you think
much shorter.
Why do you think that is? Why do we love this idea of the Regency?
Well, so some of it I think has to do with the time where George IV is actually in charge and sort of governing social trends. He was a really big patron of the arts. He like really sponsored a lot of things that really drove what we think of as the Regency. So I think that that's part of it. It's also easy, I think, when you're talking about it's not usually like it's not a polite term to use, but wallpaper historicals. Those are the ones where like history is just happening in the background. It's on the wallpaper, and it's very easy to set something in the Regency era because you're not bringing in a lot of technology. You're not bringing in a lot of like the social classes are so stratified in the Regency era that you basically don't have class crossover. Like you don't have a lot of people are not mixing ideas as much. They're able to be more isolated from the things that make them uncomfortable if they're in the upper classes. So when we're reading this as a romance, it's a really nice place to have a ballroom. It's a really nice place to have these other just like social interactions. If you really want a lot of really good character-driven romance, it happens during the Regency because there's just so much room for like character growth and exposition and things that I find really interesting when I'm looking for a Regency romance. So in the Regency era, this is the Napoleonic Wars are happening right now. So 1815 is when Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. So that's about halfway into that Regency era. So that's something to think about. In terms of, I mentioned earlier, King George was having mental illness issues sort of all throughout this era, but 1811 is when Parliament finally said, get this guy off the throne, we need to put somebody else in place, but they had to make a prince regent because he wasn't dead yet. It took him a little while to die, actually. It's kind of impressive how long he held on. So, and again, and like the sort of last bit of that is that massive separation of wealth and power. And the sort of the landed gentry like really owning everything in the land.
Okay.
That's why I really loved, and I think all of us have shared this post today, that Tori Loves HEAs, who will be lecturing with us next week, shared on the Regency period and Georgette Heyer, and just challenging, her history and use of anti-Semitic tropes and use of racist character depictions, things like that. But there was a point she made about the Regency that I thought was really interesting, because she was talking about how because Heyer was the first one to kind of sensationalize like the Regency period for romance, she kind of like set the expectation of what dialogue was like for the Regency. But it was just her dialogue. It wasn't how people spoke in the Regency. It's not like, so she created this kind of like fictional world that we all think of as the Regency, whether or not that's really historically accurate. So I appreciated, obviously check out Tori's post because it really goes into great depth on this. But again, to your point too, Meg, of like, there's a lot of Regency romances really isolate outside of politics. They're really whitewashed because there's an established tradition of a very long time, which is why you see newer authors sometimes diving into other periods. But it's an interesting thing to examine. Yeah,
that's absolutely true. And I talk a little bit, I love world building generally. World building is like my thing in science fiction and fantasy. And I think one of the reasons I gravitated so much towards historical romance is that it is a world-building exercise. You are choosing the components of the historical world that you want to illustrate in your stories. And in the Regency era, we have that tradition of Georgette Heyer, of sort of those ballrooms and the sort of banter. Like there's a lot of that comes out of Heyer's imagination, but some of it comes from Jane Austen too. Yeah. She was writing in this period, so there is some of that. But even that, you're still world building. You're still choosing who you're talking about, how you're talking about them, who gets to come and like be a part of that main character story.
Which details you include about the world. Yeah,
exactly. Mm-hmm. So I want to hit a couple high-level books on this one. Yep. Some things that are the really popular ones: Spindle Cove by Tessa Dare. That's in this era. Bridgerton, obviously, in this era. It's interesting. I've read Bridgerton a number of times. I've read and reread them. I don't know what years most of those take place in. One of the things that, in terms of looking for something that was like a lot of history in this time period, obviously, A Lady for a Duke by Alexis Hall. The main character sort of originally dies and then has her own rebirth after Waterloo. So that's, I think, really interesting. We've also got The Viscount Made Me Do It by Diana Quincy. That's actually set in 1816, so we have characters of Levantine descent living in England at that time period, so there definitely are historical roots of minority characters. And then one of my favorites of the era is Miss Wonderful by Loretta Chase, where they go into canals in great detail. And that's an amazing just an amazing story about like travel and transportation and what people were doing before trains.
It's also a great romance if you are patient with the canals. I love it.
Yeah, it's really good. It pays off. But for a while you're like, oh, so we're like still talking about the canal. But it's great. Okay, so as we head into the late Georgian, early Victorian eras, I want to just tell all of our Romancelandia University students that in order to claim 2 points of extra credit, here's what you need to do. Listen up. This is how you get your extra credit. You have to DM me the word railway. When you DM me the word railway, you will get 2 points of extra credit. So you can do that if you're watching later or if you're watching now. All right. Now,
awesome.
Continuing.
Excellent. So I ended up grouping sort of the post-Regency and late Georgian and early Victorian eras together. And I did that because, again, I like to think about things in terms of social trends. That post-Regency, late Georgian era, 1820 to 1837, I also did this because I have like only two books that fall in, two like sets of books that fall into that time period. But you start to see the common people, the non-aristocratic people, getting really anxious and well, let's call it upset at the aristocracy for not giving them rights. It's the beginning of it's the Industrial Revolution. They're working in the factories. They want their own say in places. So in 1819, the Peterloo Massacre was 60,000 people gathered to demand reform of parliamentary representation, which is like a lot. That's a lot of people. And there was a cavalry charge, and a bunch of people died, and a bunch of people were injured. But I saw a quote that's called it a political earthquake in the northern powerhouse of the Industrial Revolution. I just thought that was a really interesting way to sort of phrase moving on to sort of this post-Regency, late Georgian, and early Victorian era. The Slavery Abolition Act was in 1833, which I think is interesting also that it both happens later in our imaginations, but also maybe earlier in our imaginations than I think we'd like to think about. So there's this sort of situational, like, let's talk about when slavery was officially outlawed in terms of buying and shipping new slaves in from the British Empire. And that does not count like people who were already enslaved, who maybe were being bred for purposes of staying there. Which is terrible. Anyway, that's a really big highlight because there are some books that actually will touch on that and refer to that era, and I think it's really important to recognize that. The whole era is marked by political instability in the lower classes, and then also the expansion of railway travel. So this is why we have railroads. But railway travel expanding in the 1840s. The first actual intercity railway, I found this while I was doing research, opened in 1830 from Liverpool to Manchester. Super cool. So in terms of your early sort of like late or sort of late Regency, or sorry, late Georgian era, the Dressmaker series by Loretta Chase, one of my favorites, has the best fashion descriptions. It's also, you have women who own businesses, and you have a lot of just really smart characters, really smart dialogue, but Loretta Chase also takes clips from other history and other journals that she's found and weaves them into her story. And then the Wallflower series by Lisa Kleypas, 1842. It's a lot later than people think. So I wanted to hit that as sort of a high level here.
Definitely gets grouped into Regency,
That's
particularly when
early Victorian.
Yeah, it is early Victorian.
Emily and I say now as though we never called it Regency before.
Well, it's funny because I actually, my brain, I assumed it actually happened earlier, not that it was Regency. Or not that it, I just didn't know that it was 1842 until fairly recently. So just to give people a time frame, the Victorian era starts in 1837, which is when Victoria ascends the throne. And then... Yep.
You reminded me of that great little shout out for anybody who's read the Dressmaker series. The storyline with her daughter in book 1 trying to see Princess Victoria, trying to escape into the palace. So it's okay, some contextualizing,
Princess
orienting in time.
Of Albania.
Yes.
Reflecting the presence of Princess Victoria and getting it.
Yep.
Good for
getting
you, Carol.
Yeah, right? Yeah, so that's, I don't remember what year the first book of that is, but the third book is 1835, so I think it's 1833, 1834 for the first book. Okay, so the late Victorian era. This is actually one of my favorites to read. So I'm sort of putting late Victorian as 1870 to 1901. It also corresponds with La Belle Epoque from France and Europe, and then the Gilded Age in the U.S. So this is, Kelsey and I like to talk about, this is the Broke Aristocrats era. All of that land that everybody owned started going fallow. They were not using great farming mechanisms to keep the money going. A lot of their wealth had come primarily from rents pulled off of the land, and they no longer were getting that. So the people who basically diversified their business interests by owning factories. Those are the people who still had money, but they were also kind of considered workers, which was still considered gauche, so you didn't really want to do that, which is also really interesting. And then you have the wealthy heiresses from the United States coming in for titles. That just says, here comes the dollar princesses. That's exactly right. People with a lot of money from elsewhere who are like, I have money, I want a title. And people were like, yeah, I have a land.
I want money.
So I think that's really, really fascinating. International travel became more accessible. A lot of people, not even just the very wealthy, but a lot of other people could travel between England and the United States or England and Europe. So you'd have more people traveling to a lot of places or to a lot of the colonies because they actually, there were outposts in a lot of places. So travel from, England to India would have been fairly common as well. The other thing that I really enjoy about this era is the rise of the labor unions and workers' rights movements, because I really like this mixing of political classes and socioeconomic classes, and I find that it's really fascinating for character development, and it gives a lot more room for just like the history person in me just like really enjoys digging into some of those those dynamics. So a couple of high-level books from that era. A lot of people have recently read the E.V. Dunmore series, Bringing Down the Duke. That's 1879. The Heiress Gets a Duke by Harper St. George, that whole series with the fancy dresses on the covers, that starts in 1857. Those are heiresses from the U.S. coming to England for titles. The Hotel of Secrets by Diana Biller, that's fantastic because it actually gives you a lot of European history if you can actually sit through the history lesson for the first 2 chapters, which is a lot. But it's really fascinating to see some of the economic impacts on different wars in continental Europe that we don't see as much in British historical romance. The Lady Sherlock series starts in 1886. Obviously, personal favorite. And then the Caribbean Heiress in Paris by Adrian Herrera, that actually focuses on the World's Fair in Paris, the Paris Exposition, which is fantastic. Getting to see that international flair, people from all over the world came to that. That was your trip of a lifetime was to go see that exposition. So setting a book in that time is really fantastic.
Love the Victorian era. It's funny because I feel like the more I started reading in historical romance, the more I realized, and even as we were going through our lists for books, realizing now that I've actually read far fewer Regency than Victorian, because so many of the writers who really lean in on class difference plots, and trash for broke aristocrat, really humbling. I just really like that storyline.
Yeah.
And that's all Victorian. Sherry Thomas is writing Victorian, Duran writing some. E.V. Dunmore.
Because the more historical romances you read, the more you're like, oh, the aristocrats are just the billionaires of their day, and I don't read contemporary billionaire. A lot of us don't read contemporary billionaire because we think that's icky, and then all of a sudden there's all these historicals where the aristocrats are broke as hell. Yeah. And it's just very affirming. It's very affirming. It feels good.
Love it. Anna Marie and the Fox. I was just thinking about that one. I'm glad that Andy James Author called that out because that's one I was thinking about in relation specifically, Meg, to your points around the abolition movement, and we see in some of those romances the reality of how limited some of those actions really were and how many holes there were in the system and people who were still obviously exploiting the slave trade for a long time after that. And so that's one, Anna Marie and the Fox. Gideon, our suffrage abolition hero.
Well, and you also obviously with that one get a little bit of Mexican history as well, which is fascinating. And again, maybe we should expand to do North American history for part 2. Yes. I have a couple of other favorites from this era that I just want to shout out because I love them. One of the things you see a lot more of is more diversity in characters because you have more of this international travel. You have people who came from the colonies originally all around the world to come settle in England because that was where a big center of trade would be. So The Duke Who Didn't by Courtney Milan, the series with the Wedgwood Trials, those have that's basically set in a town that is primarily East Asian population, and it's really fascinating to because towns like that existed, and that it's really great to see that in historical romances. And then Bookshop Cinderella by Laura Lee Gurkey is just a really outstanding example of what the aristocrats were doing at the time. Things feel more modern in the late Victorian era, and that's something that I think a lot of people who are just dipping their toes into historical romance can really embrace. And then
I love that you brought up the Milan. I forgot because she has that author's note for Duke Who Didn't, and it's so lovely because she talks about, people would challenge her that Wedgford was anachronistic, and she documents how it's not anachronistic at all. These people, there was much more diversity again than we see in the whitewashed kind of representations of it in early historical romance. But I love that she says, my only invention in this is that I created a town where they were allowed to stay. Yeah. And that really stuck with me. Just a beautiful way to kind of build a world there.
Yeah. And then The Helene and the Hero by Emily Sullivan. I love Emily Sullivan as a writer, and that's a woman who owns her own business in the late 19th century, who is trying to sort of expand her business interests. It's a second chance romance, and it's really wonderful. So that's the end of the late Victorian era. We're going to go right into Edwardian. It basically goes from the end of the Victorian era straight up into World War I. Hot tip, World War I is going to be my next really big deep dive because I just read The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Catherine Arden and loved it. And we can talk about that at a different time, but there's some really interesting World War I things. But the thing that stands out with the Edwardian era is sort of it's a 14-year period of peace and prosperity. There's not a lot of big wars going on, so for a lot of people, World War I caught them by surprise because they're like, oh, things are going great. That wasn't the case, obviously. But the upper classes embraced leisure sports, so we started to see women competing in tennis and other sorts of sort of extracurricular games being really popular for people. The rise of journalism, obviously journalism has existed for as long as people have been talking about what's going on. But I think one of the things that's really interesting about it is the rise of journalism as an industry. And there's definitely some books that hit on that. And I think I don't actually have, I had a really hard time finding books in this time period, but I do think that there are a lot more out there. So I'm hoping that when we actually post our timeline that people can give us more tips on this. But when you think of the Edwardian era, the big thing you think about is the Titanic. So the Titanic sank in the Edwardian era. That's, I think, everything that you saw in that movie in terms of the outfits, the way the aristocrats function, the way the lower classes function, that just really grabs a lot of what the Edwardian era felt like. The rich being very rich and not giving a shit about anything, and the poor being pretty poor and risking everything to try to find a new life. So I think that's really interesting. And then the books, A Marvelous Light by Freya Marsk, that series, one of my favorites, and I will never stop recommending it. It's fantasy romance set in the Edwardian era. And then I have two that I had to ask Plottress Meg to help me with, and that is the Brotherhood of Blood series by Catherine Smith, which is paranormal romance set in the Edwardian era. So you know that I'm going to be reading that. And then another Laura Lee Gurkey, Scandal of the Year. That whole series is set in the Edwardian era as well. So.
Oh my God.
Oh yes, and Joan Says Samantha, American Girl doll. That's Edwardian. Yes, that is. So I really liked that one too. I grew up reading the Samantha stories, and that. I think that must be one of the reasons I gravitate to late Victorian and early Edwardian.
And so this ends with World War I.
World War I. Yeah, and actually, if anyone wants to go further, World War I and post World War I, the Stevie Sparks series, Surrendering to the Duke and Despising the Duke. Yeah. So the fascinating thing about that is once you have vacuum cleaners in your historical romances that are also still people wearing corsets. I think that that's really amazing, and this is from the Catherine Arden book, which is not romance. It has some romantic arcs, but it is absolutely a historical fiction with a little bit of a fantasy twist to it. But she said that this era is fascinating because it's very science fiction-y, because you have these people who are they're gassing each other on the fields with mustard gas. And, you know, you have these nurses who are wearing full-length dresses, wearing gas masks, running out onto the fields.
Yeah.
And it's like a very like weird feel of like modern and not modern. And a lot of writers, there's not a lot of World War I fiction out there, because a lot of writers basically distance themselves from that by making it dystopian, which I thought was fascinating. That all came from Catherine Arden's note. So.
That's interesting. Oh, I like this KJC shout out for the
Yeah.
Will Darling adventures,
Yeah.
the early 1920s.
I also wanted to note before we got too far away that Krista had also commented about a book called Mr. Warren's Profession by Sebastian Nothwell, which is a male romance set in the 1890s, written by a man. So this is like the unicorn of historical romances, and we love to see it. So I for one am going to add that to my TBR. I just read Will Darling Adventures, and that's a great just post World War I with characters who have like fought in that war. Also, don't forget the Titanic sinks in 1912. So that's the Edwardian period.
Yeah.
That's what kicks off Downton Abbey.
Oh, yeah.
And,
I forgot about Downton Abbey.
And that just feels like a world history event that we're all sort of acquainted with, and it can immediately help place you in the story if you're reading the story in the Edwardian period.
Yeah,
it's now become my restless truth period, because that Freya Marsk ocean liner adventure mystery romance has kind of established itself now for me.
Yeah, she basically picked that era because she wanted basically to set something on a White Star Liner like the Titanic.
That's
and it doesn't sink, so
it doesn't sink.
Definitely
They did not sink. The Titanic was one that sank. Some of them did sink.
Yeah. Spoiler alert that in this romance, the boat does not sink. Oh, no.
So that's what I wanted to talk about. That's sort of the overview of the genres. Ultimately, I want more people to just read historical romance generally, and to think, when you pick up a book, think about, is it Regency? Is it not Regency? Is it in a different era? And then look at some of those major trends. Some of them are through fashion. Some of them are through different plot devices that the authors are using. But that's really, anybody who attends this, next time I see you calling, a Sherry Thomas book a Regency, I'm coming after you in the comments.
Or when...
Sorry, are they in a barouche? Are they in a...
Emily is whipping out her new knowledge. Because I did this, like, as an early historical romance reader, I remember trying to sell a coworker on Evie Dunmore's series as I'm like, you love Bridgerton. In my head, these are like equivalent. It's like, it's in England like a long time ago. So yes, we do not equate Bridgerton to Victorian era romances. We don't do it.
We don't do it. But also, if you do it, thanks for reading historical romance with us. It's fine.
It's true. I'll actually come after you.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to remember, if any of you listen to Fated Mates on Fated Mates, they always are reminding you that historical romance has more in common with fantasy than it does with reality.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, for me, I'm reading A Miraculous Light right now, and I've been taking forever to read it, and I think part of it is because I like to tell myself a little fantasy story that I'm learning history when I read historical romance. Mm-hmm. And when a book is and then the magic happens, I'm like, wait a minute, I'm trying to be serious right now, okay? I'm trying to be at school. I'm getting so smart. And then the book is girl, you've been reading a fantasy the whole time, and you were reading a fantasy when you were reading that other Kleypas book or whatever. So it's all to say, it's all in good fun. You actually are probably learning so much about the history of England as you're reading these stories, and that makes it even more fun to branch outside of England and learn the history of other places during similar periods of time. Hopefully this chat has helped some of you who love historical romance to begin with to just sort of be able to place yourself easily within a story.
I love it.
All right.
Thank you, Meg.
Thank you so much, Meg.
Well, thank you.
This was really
fun.
This
was so much fun.
And we will have a little companion post later in the week for all of you to sort of help visualize all of this information. Meg, the way that you pulled up 24 titles and gave us a date for when they take place, that is heroic, amazing.
Yeah.
And of the ones that I gave you, I think I've only not read the two of those from. Well, I haven't read the Sarah MacLean's that I gave you, and I haven't read all of the Edwardian era ones because I was a little stumped on those. But the rest of them I've read.
You need to go through the comments. Krista has the Edwardian era Rex, it looks like.
Yeah, everybody take a second, peep the comments for some
Before we go,
Edwardian Rex. Before
It
you
will disappear when we transition this to record it, which I hate.
But we do have a nice list.
Yeah.
So if these disappear and you're posting them and you want to remember to post them in the comments of that companion post, they will be preserved there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So C.L. Polk that Krista calls out, they're a really fantastic author, non-binary author who writes romance and fantasy romances. So highly recommend their work. And I have not read the Kingston Cycle, but it's the one that has the bicycle on the front. For which Mark is the first one. Yeah. Anyway.
Awesome.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Meg. This was so fun. Thank you all for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.